There is a photograph most people have never seen. Spring 1966, a Chicago slum called Lawndale. Martin Luther King Jr. stands in a cramped, rat-infested apartment, the walls peeling around him. And for the first time in the public record, the man who told the world about his dream looks completely lost. By every measurable account, he had won the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, a Nobel Peace Prize, the ear of a sitting president. The world called him a hero. History was already carving his face into marble. And yet, standing in that Lawndale apartment, something cracked open inside him. Not loudly, not dramatically, but slowly, like a fault line shifting deep underground. The ground of everything he had built began to move. What happened in those final 3 years is the story history tends to skip. It is not the king of the marble monument. It is the king who looked at everything he had achieved and asked, in the quiet of his conscience, a question that should shake anyone who has ever sprinted toward a goal they were told to want. He asked, "What does it profit a man to integrate into a burning house?" That question is the subject of this film, because if you have ever sprinted toward a finish line only to cross it and feel nothing, if you have ever achieved exactly what the world told you to achieve and found yourself standing in a life that does not belong to you, then this is your story too. This is the story of the integration trap, and Martin Luther King Jr. was its most famous prisoner. To understand the trap, go back before Montgomery, before the boycott, to the theology that shaped his soul. King was not, at his core, a political strategist. He was a preacher, son of a preacher, grandson of a preacher. He believed, with full spiritual conviction, that the universe bent toward justice, not metaphorically, literally. He believed that if the doors of America's institutions were forced open, if black children could sit in the same classrooms and vote in the same booths, the promise of America would finally become true for everyone. That was the dream, not a vague aspiration, a specific operational vision, the right to enter the rooms where power lived. And so he organized, he marched, he absorbed the blows in Birmingham and Selma with a discipline that staggered the world. He spoke with a cadence that made even his opponents feel the weight of their own wrong. He won. The legislation passed. The doors opened. And for a brief, brilliant moment, it seemed as though the dream was real. But here is where the trap was already set. Here is the crack in the foundation nobody wanted to see. King won the right to enter the house. And nobody stopped to ask whose house it was, or what it was built on, or whether the house itself was on fire. By 1966, the evidence was no longer avoidable. Black Americans had the right to vote, but poverty rates had barely moved. The ghettos of Chicago and Detroit were no longer segregated by law. They were segregated by money, by centuries of compounded theft, by a system that had actively used their bodies and labor to build its benefits for someone else. King began to say this out loud. The world did not want to hear it. His approval ratings collapsed. The newspapers that had praised him called him reckless. Politicians whispered he had gone too far. The FBI redoubled its efforts to destroy him. Within his own movement, voices asked whether the prophet had lost the plot. He had not lost the plot. He had found it. But the finding of it cost him nearly everything. Now, before we go further, something needs to be said directly to you. Maybe you are working harder than ever and feeling less certain than ever. Maybe you have been chasing a version of success built on someone else's blueprint, and something in your gut has started to whisper that the blueprint does not fit the life you want. That whisper is not weakness. That whisper is the beginning of wisdom. It is exactly what King heard in 1966. And if you want to understand what to do with it, you need to stay with this story, because the next part is where it gets real. If this kind of thinking speaks to something in you, like this video and subscribe right now. Not as a favor to an algorithm, as a declaration that you refuse to sprint toward a finish line you never chose. It took King courage to make that declaration. And what happened to him next is the part that textbooks leave out. The year is 1967. King is in a small room in Atlanta, surrounded by his closest advisors, saying something none of them expected to hear. He is not talking about voting rights. He is talking about Vietnam, about poverty, about capitalism, and he is saying that these things are not separate problems. They're the same problem wearing different masks. On April 4th, 1967, King stood at Riverside Church in New York and delivered a speech the world was not ready for. He called the United States government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. He connected Vietnam to the war on poor people at home. He said any nation spending more on military defense than social uplift is approaching spiritual death. The reaction was ferocious. The New York Times called it a disservice to the civil rights cause. Life magazine called it a demagogic slander. Lyndon Johnson refused to ever meet with him again. Many of King's own advisors had begged him not to give that speech. "Stay in the lane that made you great," they said. He gave the speech anyway, because something had shifted inside him that could not be unshifted. And this is where the story leaves the realm of history and enters the realm of psychology. Because what King was experiencing in 1967 has a name, even if the history books do not use it. He was experiencing the terror of unlearning. King had built his strategy on one premise. America's problem was exclusion. Let us in, and the system will work for all of us. By 1967, the evidence was overwhelming that the premise was incomplete. The house was not just locked, it was burning, and the fire had been built into the walls from the beginning. This is the moment that breaks most people. When the life's work looks suddenly terrifyingly small against the scale of the actual problem. Most people do one of two things. They deny what they have seen and keep running toward the old finish line. Or they collapse. They let the gap between belief and reality swallow them whole. King did neither. He chose to begin again. Not by abandoning what he had built, but by refusing to let what he had built become the ceiling of his courage. The first step was honest accounting. The Civil Rights Act gave legal standing, not economic ground. The Voting Rights Act gave access, not power. These were not failures. They were the limits of a strategy built for a specific phase, and that phase was over. The honest accounting did not erase the victories. It contextualized them, placed them in proper proportion within a larger battle not yet won. And that contextualization, painful as it was the first act of building something truer. In 1968, King launched the Poor People's Campaign, not a march for black rights alone, but a march for poor people of every background. Black, white, Latino, Native American. The largest multiracial economic justice campaign in American history. A direct expression of the new framework built from the wreckage of the old one. It was also, by conventional measures, a mess. Underfunded, politically outflanked. The Resurrection City encampment was rained out, harassed by police, and eventually bulldozed. King did not live to see it. He was killed in Memphis on April 4th, 1968, while supporting a strike by black sanitation workers paid poverty wages by a city that refused to see them as human. The sanitation workers' signs read, "I am a man, not I have rights. I am a man." 3 words that contained everything King had come to understand about what the fight was actually for. Not the right to enter the burning house, the right to be recognized as a full human being in a world rebuilt on different terms entirely. Now, here's what this means for you. This story is not an abstraction. It is a map. The integration trap is alive right now, in the choices you're making and the goals you're running toward. It operates every time you chase a version of success designed by a system that does not have your flourishing at its center. It looks like working 80 hours a week in a career that makes you money, but hollows you out. It looks like climbing a ladder only to find at the top that it is leaning against the wrong wall. It looks like winning a game whose rules were written before you arrived for the benefit of people who are not you. The first step out of the trap is honest accounting. Name what you have actually won. Not what you were told you won, not what it looks like from the outside, what it actually costs, what it has not given you. Even if that accounting undoes years of effort and pride. The second step is reframing. King did not walk away from the struggle. He took the tools he had built and pointed them at a larger and truer target. You do not need to blow up your life. You need to ask honestly whether the goal you're building towards serves the life you want. If the answer is no, you redirect. The third step is the hardest. Going public with the new vision when the people who believed in the old one are not ready to follow. King knew the cost at Riverside. He knew the editorials that were coming. He gave the speech anyway, chose truth over comfort, and that choice made the final year of his life the most important one. The true version ends in Memphis, A man stripped of popularity, standing with workers earning $4 a day in a city that refused to see them as human. He had always said every person made in the image of God deserved to be treated as such. When early victories revealed a deeper battle, he carried the banner further. That is the Phoenix strategy. Not a slick system, a choice. A daily, costly, courageous choice to remain honest about what is true and committed to what matters, even when the world you built your credibility in turns against you for it. Most people stay in the burning house because it is the house they know. Their identity is in that house. The fear of stepping out is more terrifying than the slow suffocation of a life that does not fit. King chose to leave. That choice is why he is remembered as one of the few who refused to let his success become his cage. There is a question at the center of this story. The question that the most important work of your life depends on you being willing to ask. Are you working towards something you chose, or something you were given and never questioned? Because the integration trap is not about race or politics. It is about the human tendency to absorb the metrics of success from the surrounding culture and run toward them with tremendous discipline, without ever asking whether those metrics measure anything that matters to you. You can be extraordinarily successful by every external measure and still be standing in a burning house. The fire does not feel like fire when you are used to the heat. It just feels like the normal temperature of ambition. King felt that heat in 1966, standing in a Chicago slum, and instead of turning away, he let it change him. Transforming the scar into strength is not about pretending the wound was not real. King spoke openly about his depression in those years, about his fear that the dream was receding, about the burden of leading a movement into territory that terrified even its most loyal members. The strength came from the refusing to stop. He said in one of his final sermons just weeks before his death, "We must accept finite disappointment but never lose infinite hope." Not blind optimism, infinite hope in the hands of a man who has looked at the worst of what is true and refused to let it be the final word. That is the only kind of strength that works when the terrain gets hard and the applause goes quiet. The strength of the person who has decided that what they're working toward is worth the cost of being misunderstood. The first movement of this framework is recognition. You have to see the trap before you can leave it. The honesty that says, this is not working for me. Not because I am not working hard enough, but because the goal itself may not be aimed at anything I actually need. The second movement is the willingness to grieve. King grieved between 1966 and 1968. He was mourning the version of the struggle he had believed in, with everything he had. You cannot skip that mourning. It is not weakness. It is the price of having cared about something real. The third movement is the rebuilding. Not a rebuilding that erases what came before, but one that takes the best of it and lays it on a foundation that is honest. A foundation that has looked at the burning house and said, I will not live here. I will build something new, on ground that is real. That rebuilding is never finished. But the moment when you decide to stop running towards someone else's finish line and start walking, honestly, toward your own, that is the most important moment in any life. King stood at that moment in a crumbling apartment, making the most important decision of his life, not on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, but in the quiet of an honest conversation with himself. The answer changed him, and the changed version of him was the most genuinely revolutionary version of Martin Luther King Jr. that ever lived. It is also the version history is least comfortable talking about, because the comfortable version ends with the dream. The true version begins with the question, and the question is still alive right now, in the way you are spending your time, your energy, your ambition. The integration trap is asking you right now, whose house are you trying to enter? And is that house the one you actually want to live in? There's something else history sanitizes. King was afraid. He told his closest companions he did not believe he would live to old age. He spoke of the death threats with the weariness of a man who had stopped counting them. And yet, he kept going. Every morning, the fear in one hand and the commitment in the other. Not because he was superhuman, but because he had arrived at a clarity that made the fear manageable. The clarity of a man who knows what he is for. Not just what he has achieved, but what he is fundamentally, irrevocably for. He was for the recognition of the full humanity of every person on earth. That was his North Star. Once you strip away the reputation management and arrive at the simple truth of what you are actually for, fear becomes navigable. It does not disappear. but it becomes navigable. The trap is not about what you're running toward. It is about whether you know what you're for. Most people who fall into it have applied extraordinary discipline to a goal handed to them before they were old enough to question it. The harder you work toward the inherited goal, the more invested you become in its validity. King had 20 years invested in the integration strategy when he began to see its limits. Facing those limits did not mean discarding everything. It meant looking at what he had built and asking honestly, what of this is true? What of this is mine? What of this is worth carrying into the next chapter? King found those answers not in triumph, not in the roar of a crowd, but in the quiet of a Chicago slum, standing in a room that smelled of poverty and neglect. In that room, the prophet did what prophets do. He told the truth, first to himself, then to Riverside Church, then to Memphis, then to the ages. The truth he told, the goal was never to integrate into the system as it exists. It was to transform the system into something worthy of the people it serves. Integration was a tactic. Love was the strategy. And love, fierce and redemptive, does not settle for a seat at a table built on injustice. It builds a new table, on new ground, with new terms. There is a version of your life that looks like success from the outside and feels like exile from the inside. King lived that for a season and chose to leave. The life that belongs to you is not the one you were handed. It is the one you build when you walk, with honest feet, toward your own finish line. King's final sermon was called The Drum Major Instinct, delivered on February 4th, 1968, at Ebenezer Baptist Church, the church of his childhood. He preached about the human desire to be first, to be great, to be seen, and he said that the only greatness worth having is the greatness of service. Not the Nobel Prize, not the photograph with the president. The greatness of the man who stood with sanitation workers because they were being denied their humanity. 2 months later, he was gone. But the question remains, what kind of greatness are you building? The kind the world will photograph, or the kind that will matter when the photograph is forgotten? Subscribe now, not as a passive click, but as the declaration it is. The arc of your life bends not automatically, but intentionally. You decide, with full knowledge of the cost, to pull it towards something true. King made that decision in a crumbling Lawndale apartment. He made it at Riverside Church. He made it in Memphis. Now it is your turn.